Silence isn't empty. Silence has a sound. If you listen long enough, you can hear it breathing. That's the first thing I learned about working nights at a library. True silence isn't peace. It's a weight. It presses down on you until even your heartbeat sounds intrusive. I never used to think much about silence before. I was a journalist once. The kind who lived off noise, city chaos, arguments in newsrooms, the tap of keyboards, and the buzz of breaking news. I thought I'd always belonged to that world. Turns out, silence had been waiting for me for a long time. My name is Arjun Malhotra, 32 years old, a man whose dreams died quietly and didn't even leave a note behind. I used to write for the Delhi Post, mostly human interest stories at first, poverty, corruption, politics. I believed foolishly that exposing darkness would bring light, that people cared, that the truth mattered. Then I published a story that ended everything. It was about Minister Singh, a man so powerful his face was plastered on every government banner in the capital. I found proof he was involved in something unspeakable: rural disappearances, ritual practices, blood sacrifices. I had photographs, interviews, and a source who vanished a week before publication. When the story went live, I thought it would be my career's peak. Instead, it was my obituary. The minister sued for defamation. The paper withdrew support. My editor turned cold, and suddenly I was the one on trial. They revoked my credentials. The media called me unstable. My reputation dissolved in a week. I lost my job, my apartment, and the small circle of people who used to call me friend. By the time I packed my things into a single duffel bag, my father had already passed away. A heart attack, alone in our old house in Naghtkeeper, the same small town where I grew up. I remember standing in that house, peeling walls, silent fans, and a smell of dust, feeling like I had come full circle only to end where I started. When I found an advertisement in a local paper, night librarian wanted, Ravenholm Public Library, Naghtkeeper, 8 p.m. 6 a.m., single vacancy, I took it. I told myself I just needed money and a place that wouldn't ask questions. What I didn't know was that Ravenholm had questions of its own. The first time I saw it, I thought the building looked tired. The Ravenholm Public Library sat at the very edge of Naghtkeeper, where the town gave way to forest. Built in the late 1800s, it was once the private mansion of an English collector named Edward Halbrook, later donated to the town after his disappearance. Locals still called it Halbrook House. The road to it curved through dense gulmohar trees, their branches forming a kind of crimson canopy. In the evenings, as I'd walk to my shift, I'd hear crickets and sometimes the distant call of jackals. The air always smelled faintly of rain and old wood. The building rose from the earth like a forgotten relic, red brick walls streaked with moss, black iron railings curling like vines, and a large broken clock tower frozen at 3. That clock became an obsession later, but not yet. When I first entered, the heavy teak doors groaned like something alive. The inside air felt different, colder, heavier, like the kind of air that had learned to carry secrets. The caretaker met me inside. Mr. Das, thin, stooped, somewhere in his 60s, wore an old cardigan and spectacles thick enough to hide his eyes behind gray glare. He spoke softly, as if trying not to wake the shelves. Electricity cuts happen often, he told me during the orientation. The inverter lasts about 20 minutes. There are emergency lanterns in each aisle. Don't stay here after dawn. You'll feel tempted sometimes, but don't. That last line struck me as odd. He handed me a set of brass keys, each labeled with fading paper tags. Archives, restricted section, staff room, east wing, main gate. The last one had no label at all. Some rooms are better left locked, he said, as if reading my curiosity. He showed me around, the main reading hall lined with oak tables, aisles stacked with leather-bound volumes, the librarian's desk with its brass lamp and clock, a small washroom with a cracked mirror, and the restricted section behind glass doors marked authorized access only. Some books are not for reading, he said, locking the section again. They're for keeping. That night when he left, I heard the main door's bolt slide shut. I was alone. At first, it wasn't bad. I spent the first week dusting shelves, cataloging old issues, and reading stray chapters from forgotten novels. The silence grew familiar, comforting, almost. The steady tick of the desk clock, the smell of paper, the sound of pages turning as if the air itself liked to read. I'd sit at the reception under the yellow lamp, sipping cold chai from my thermos, watching the shadows of bookshelves stretch and shrink as the hours passed. Ravenholm had over 10,000 volumes, most untouched for decades. A few shelves caught my attention, labeled occult studies, anthropology of death, ritualism. The titles were bizarre: The Mirror Veil, Manifestations of the Bound Spirit, Eternal Thresholds, A Study of Unseen Borders. Someone had underlined entire passages in red ink. I assumed it was the collector's work, Edward Halbrook's. In his time, the library had been his obsession. Rumors said he'd invited monks, shamans, and tantrics to perform experiments in crossing boundaries, whatever that meant. By the fifth night, I'd nearly forgotten about it all. The silence was just silence again. Until it wasn't. It was 2:57 a.m. on a Thursday. I was reshelving a few damaged journals when I heard the soft thud of a book falling. A normal sound, except it came from the far corner of the library, where I hadn't been for hours. At first, I ignored it. Old books fall all the time. But then I heard something else. The faint rustle of pages turning one by one. When I finally walked over, my flashlight beam caught it, a book standing upright in the middle of the floor, open, as though waiting to be read. Its cover was dark green leather, cracked with age, the title etched faintly in gold, The Bound Between Worlds. A sheet of yellowed paper was tucked inside, edges curled, ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was spidery, uneven. Don't look at your reflection after midnight. No context, no signature. I should have laughed. But something about the words made my skin crawl, a primal unease, like someone had whispered them directly into my ear. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. When I looked back at the book, it had closed itself. I didn't sleep that morning. The library's washroom is small, barely enough space for a sink and 2 stalls. The mirror above the basin is cracked diagonally, warping every reflection slightly. I usually avoided looking into it. But that night, around 12:30, I forgot. I washed my face, leaned forward, and looked up. For a second, everything was normal. Then the light flickered. My reflection smiled. Not the polite twitch we do out of habit. This was slow, deliberate, like a creature trying to imitate one. My reflection's eyes stayed perfectly still while its mouth curved upward. Then, without moving my real hand, the reflection lifted its hand and wrote in the mist forming on the glass, "Rule 1. I stumbled backward, knocking over the waste bin. When I blinked, the mirror was just a mirror again. The word was gone. Outside, somewhere deep in the aisles, a book fell. The following night, as the clock neared 3, I began hearing whispers. At first, I thought it was the building. Old structures make noises. But then it shaped itself into my name. Arjun. Soft, female, close enough to feel the breath of it. I froze. "Arjun, help me." My throat went dry. Mr. Das's voice echoed in my memory. "If you hear something strange, pretend you didn't." So I didn't move, didn't answer. The whisper came again from behind the nearest shelf. Then, just beside my ear, a cold voice said, "I'm behind you." The silence that followed was thicker than air. I didn't turn around. That was the longest hour of my life. When dawn came, I almost convinced myself it was a dream. But the next evening, I noticed something that stripped away that illusion. The large portrait above the main staircase, the one of Edward Halbrook, the collector, had changed. The paint on his eyes had turned black, not dark blue, not faded. Black, like someone had smeared charcoal over them. I asked Mr. Das about it that morning. He frowned, looked up at the portrait, then at me. "It changes sometimes," he said simply. "Leave it alone." That night, a second note appeared, slipped under the librarian's desk. Keep the reading lamp lit. Always, same handwriting. It hadn't been there when my shift began. By the 7th night, I'd started to notice small inconsistencies. Books that I'd shelved properly would be displaced by morning. Footprints appeared in the dust on the upper balcony, though I never went up there. And the temperature dropped sharply between 2 and 4 a.m., no matter the weather outside. Once I swore I saw the clock in the tower move. Only a second, the hand twitching forward from 3 to 3:01 before snapping back again. I told myself it was imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Places remember things, especially places built for remembering. The town's record said Edward Halbrook was a British historian who settled here after an expedition to the Himalayan monasteries. He collected manuscripts on mysticism, spirit lore, and pre-Vedic rituals. In his final year, neighbors reported hearing chanting from the house at night. Then, one monsoon morning, he vanished. Police found the mansion in disarray, shelves toppled, symbols drawn on the floor in ash, and Halbrook's journal torn open beside an unfinished note. The 8th rule is incomplete. She is almost free. No one ever discovered who she was. It was around 4:10 a.m. when I decided to check the restricted section for myself. The key turned reluctantly, the door groaning open like a protest. Inside, the air was colder, stiller, thick with dust that hung like fog in my flashlight's beam. The books here were older, some wrapped in silk, others bound with thread. On the librarian's desk sat an open book. It wasn't just open, it was alive. The pages were blank when I first looked. Then, slowly, letters began to appear. In ink darker than black, "I see you, Arjun." I dropped the light. The bulb cracked on the floor. For a moment I thought I saw movement, the outline of a tall figure between the shelves too still to be human. I ran. The next morning when I came to collect my bag, Mr. Das was already there. He looked pale. "You read something you shouldn't have," he said softly. I said nothing. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The rules exist for a reason. The collector wrote them before he disappeared. They're what keep her from crossing." "Her?" I asked. Mr. Das looked toward the dark hallway that led to the restricted section. "You'll know when she finds you." That night, I found another note taped to the clock tower door. At 3, "Don't respond." At 4, "Wait in the restricted section. Silence will protect you." No one had entered or left the building since my shift began. The door was locked. Somewhere in the dark, the clock ticked. The second hand twitched, once, twice, then stopped again at 3. And in that silence, I finally realized this wasn't just a haunted building, it was a trap, and I had already stepped inside it. Nightfall always felt heavier here than anywhere else I had worked. Even when I stepped through the brass doors and the last sound of the town fell behind me, the silence inside the library had a presence, like an invisible being settled in every corner. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the anticipation of it, the waiting, the slow inhale of a world holding its breath. I had started to feel it pressing on me physically. My shoulders tensed, my back ached, my ears seemed to pick up the faintest creaks and groans of the building, the floorboards whispering, the shelves subtly shivering, and sometimes, faintly, footsteps that I could not place. Some nights, I would enter, and it felt as if the library itself was watching me, weighing me, deciding if I belonged. I had begun to dread the quiet, though I had no idea why. The first week of my night shifts had passed without incident, or so I told myself. The occasional falling book I could attribute to age, the flickering lamps to faulty wiring. But something in the air was different now, something that made my skin crawl even when everything appeared normal. I would pace the aisles slowly, running my fingers along the spines of old leather-bound volumes. Some had faded gold lettering, others were cracked and blackened with age. The smell was intoxicating, dust, decay, faint mold, and the sharp tang of iron beneath it all. And then, at exactly the same time each night, around 2:53 a.m., I would feel it, a subtle vibration, like a pulse from the walls themselves. Sometimes I could swear I heard faint breathing, or a sigh, or even the sound of someone shuffling along the aisles behind me, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. I had taken to walking with my back pressed against the shelves, keeping the aisles in front of me clear. Still, my shadow seemed to move differently than I did. I noticed it more on nights when the moonlight slanted through the tall, arched windows, streaking across the floors in sharp, uneven lines. I tried to rationalize it. I had to. I was a journalist. Rationality was all I had left. Stress, exhaustion, the solitude, all perfect catalysts for hallucinations. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe I was imagining the whispers, the footsteps, the shadows that lingered just long enough to make me doubt reality. I told myself that, but the unease lingered like a second heartbeat in my chest, sinking itself to my pulse. Then there were the dreams. I had begun dreaming of the library even during the day, waking to the smell of old paper, the soft creak of floorboards, and the feeling that I wasn't alone. The dreams were always the same: long, empty aisles, shelves stretching impossibly high, and shadows flitting just out of focus. Always at the far end of the reading room, I would see a figure, never fully in view, watching me, waiting. It was during the second week that I found the next note. I had been organizing a set of manuscripts in the restricted section, the one Mr. Das had told me never to touch without authorization, when I noticed a small envelope tucked between two volumes. No handwriting on the outside, no seal, just plain brown paper. I opened it slowly, half expecting a prank. The note inside read, "If a book falls, do not touch it. It marks you." I stared at it for a long time, feeling my chest tighten. The handwriting was the same as the first note, spidery, uneven, like it had been written in haste by someone anxious to leave a warning. I remembered the first note, the warning about the mirror. Slowly, a terrible realization crept in. Someone, or something, was communicating with me. I tried to rationalize it again. Perhaps it was Mr. Das, a prankster librarian, or even some elaborate leftover of Holbrook's experiments. But my gut told me otherwise. The library seemed to hum around me, the air thick with static. My flashlight flickered as if the room itself had inhaled sharply. Somewhere behind me, a book slid across the shelf, thudding lightly. I froze. I didn't move. That night, as the clock approached 3 a.m., I felt it again, the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind through the broken vents. But the library had no wind. The doors were locked, windows were closed. Arjun, soft, deliberate, female, so close I felt the warmth of breath brush my neck. I did not respond. Mr. Das's words echoed, "If you hear something strange, pretend you didn't." Arjun. This time it was closer, just behind my shoulder. My heart beat violently. My palms were slick with sweat. The flashlight trembled in my grip. Then I heard it clearly. "I'm behind you." I spun around. Nothing. Just shelves, stacks of books, dust motes dancing in the beam of my lamp. I spent the rest of the hour in the staff room, clutching the edge of the table, waiting for the dawn. I began to notice details of the library that I had never cared for before. The floors groaned in unusual ways, not random but deliberate. The long rows of shelves formed almost labyrinthine aisles. Corners seemed to warp in the half-light. Sometimes I would glance down an aisle, and it would appear longer than it should, shelves stretching impossibly into darkness. The walls were lined with portraits, all faces pale, eyes hollow. I could swear sometimes they were not looking straight ahead but following me. The clock tower remained frozen at 3. Every time I glanced at it, I felt a shiver, though I couldn't explain why. It was as if time itself had stopped and the building had been waiting for me to arrive. Even the restricted section seemed alive. The air there was thicker, colder, and smelled faintly of iron and smoke. The shelves seemed to lean slightly inward when I walked past, and sometimes I could hear whispers coming from the manuscripts themselves, words I could not understand, yet felt as if they were warning me. I researched Holbrook during my nights off, trying to ground myself. The man had been obsessed with the mystical, Manuscripts from Himalayan monasteries, records of ancient rituals, and accounts of unseen entities that could move between worlds. The local town records were sparse. He had vanished suddenly, leaving the mansion, now library, behind. There were stories, always in whispers, screams during storms, flickering lights, shadows that moved without bodies. But I had to remind myself, these were old wives' tales, fiction, imagination. Even so, the feeling of being watched intensified. Something followed me through the aisles. I could feel it in my peripheral vision, a subtle motion, a dark shape that vanished when I turned. On the following night, I made the mistake of lingering in the main reading hall. The brass lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows across the floor. A book fell, The Bound Between Worlds. I froze, remembering the second note. If a book falls, do not touch it. It marks you. Some instinct made me approach it anyway. The moment my fingers brushed the spine, a gust of cold wind swept through the hall, knocking over several other books. My flashlight shuddered and went out, leaving me in pitch black. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate. Footsteps, soft but heavy, circling me. Then a faint whisper, almost teasing. Do you see me now, Arjun? I bolted, my heart pounding. I fled toward the staff room. My hands scraped the wall. My feet tripped over fallen manuscripts. When I finally slammed the door behind me, my breathing loud in the silence, I dared to glance back. The book lay where it had fallen, but I could swear the pages were trembling, as if something beneath them was moving. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. I began to dread entering the library each night, yet I could not ignore it. On Friday, taped to the clock tower door, I found another note. At 3, don't respond. At 4, wait in the restricted section. Silence will protect you. This one made me pause longer than the others. The specificity, the timing, the command. It was no prank. Something alive, something patient, was orchestrating my nights. I remembered the whispers, the shadows, the cold, the books that moved on their own. I'd begun following the rules instinctively, without understanding them fully. By the second week, I could no longer tell where reality ended and the library's influence began. Sometimes, I would catch glimpses of movement just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Sometimes I would feel a presence at my back, heavy, watching, waiting. And yet, when I turned my head or searched the room, there was nothing. Was it real? Or was it exhaustion, fear, and guilt manifesting itself in the silence of the night? I had no answer. I only knew that every night the library grew colder. Every night the shadows became sharper. Every night I felt less like a man working a simple night shift and more like a trespasser in a world that had been waiting for me all along. I began to dread the approach of night in a way I had never known. The daylight hours brought no relief. During the day, the library seemed just a dusty relic, tall ceilings and arched windows, a place to catalog history. At night, though, it became a living thing, breathing, watching, waiting. Every night I walked through the brass doors with a mix of dread and ritual precision. I had begun to follow the rules instinctively, though I understood only fragments. 1. Do not look at your reflection after midnight. 2. If a book falls, do not touch it. The other rules were hidden, unknown, waiting. Even the act of entering the library felt different now. The air was thicker, colder, almost viscous, and my footsteps no longer echoed normally. Sometimes I felt them offset, as if something unseen was walking just behind me, mimicking every step. That night I arrived at 7:50 p.m. The dusk outside the windows had turned the room into a dull amber, stretching the long shadows across the floor. I started by organizing journals in the occult study section. My flashlight traced spines, my fingers lingering over faded gold lettering. Some of the titles made my stomach churn, The Thresholds of Dread, Whispers in the Ashes, The Collector's Veil. As I worked, I noticed it, a subtle shift in the corner of the room. A shadow darker than the surrounding gloom detached itself from the rows of shelves. It moved fluidly, gliding rather than walking. I froze. The shadow mirrored my movements perfectly. When I lifted my hand, it lifted its own, a fraction of a second delayed. When I turned, it was gone. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, the tricks of dim light and exhaustion, but deep down I knew it wasn't. By midnight, the temperature had dropped significantly. My breath fogged in front of me, curling like small ghosts. I walked the aisle slowly as always, keeping my back pressed against the shelves. And then it began, a whisper, faint, soft, almost teasing, "Arjun." I froze. My pulse rattled in my ears. Arjun, closer. No direction, no shape, just the sound of it moving around me. I followed my own rule. I said nothing. I did not respond. I held my breath, pretending I didn't hear it. A book fell, a thin manuscript from the top shelf. My fingers itched to pick it up. I resisted. The second rule flashed in my mind. If a book falls, do not touch it. The whispers grew impatient, almost laughing. I shivered. Somehow, I knew that touching the book would mark me, though mark me for what I did not yet know. It was around 12:45 a.m. when I discovered the third rule. A small slip of parchment appeared on the librarian's desk. I swear it had not been there when I walked past 5 minutes earlier. The handwriting was identical to the first two notes, spidery, uneven, desperate. "Do not speak in the aisles. Words summon her." I read it, shivering. Speaking had never been an issue before, but suddenly the very thought of using my voice made my throat feel raw and exposed. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a prank by a previous night librarian. But deep inside, my gut screamed that rationalization was useless. The library seemed to warp at night. I had noticed it before, hallways appearing longer than they should, aisles that seemed to stretch infinitely when I turned a corner. But now it had escalated. As I moved from the main reading hall toward the restricted section, the space itself seemed to breathe. Shelves curved outward, then snapped back, as if the room were pulsing around me. I saw shadows flicker at the edges of my vision, black forms that bent unnaturally, lingering just long enough to make me look, then gone when I turned. Sometimes I heard movement on the floor above me, footsteps pacing back and forth, though I knew no one else was in the building. By the third night of these occurrences, I avoided the washroom entirely. But fate has a way of forcing confrontation. Around 1:15 a.m., I needed water. I went in, trembling, and glanced briefly into the cracked mirror. For a moment, nothing. Then, a slow, deliberate movement. My reflection blinked once, then again. But the face did not match mine. The mouth curved differently, smiling too wide. The eyes glimmered with something that was not mine, expectation, hunger, or amusement. Then, in the condensation on the glass, words began to appear. Rule 4, do not turn around when you hear her. I stumbled back, knocking over the faucet. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, and I froze. No footsteps responded. I could not tell if I had read the message with my eyes or if it had been implanted in my mind by the building itself. Later that night, I reached the restricted section. I had taken to following the note's instructions obsessively, sitting silently, waiting for time to pass. The air was heavy. The lamps flickered. Then I saw her. At first, a shadow at the far end of the aisle, just a human-shaped dark form. But as I stared, she moved, gliding, almost floating, her outline imperfect, her head too high, her limbs bending slightly wrong. I did not scream. I could not. My body was frozen. Her face, or what I could see of it, was pale, featureless, but terrifyingly familiar, as though she had known me my entire life. She paused, tilted her head, and then vanished into the shelves. No sound, no trace, nothing but the lingering cold. I began to notice a pattern with the clock tower. Every night, around 3 a.m., I felt the presence closest, the shadows longest. Time itself seemed to warp. Seconds slowed, then raced, then froze. The notes had warned me. The timing was crucial. I began checking my watch obsessively. aligning my movements with the clock tower's frozen hands, as if it controlled the very fabric of the library. By this point, exhaustion was taking its toll. Days blurred into nights. I slept poorly in the small room I rented near the library. Dreams invaded me, dark halls, whispering shelves, moving shadows. Always she appeared, standing at the end of a long aisle, waiting. Even waking, I felt her presence. My mind was fracturing under the weight of anticipation, dread, and the creeping realization that I was no longer alone. Perhaps I had never been. The fourth rule, do not turn around when you hear her, became instinct. Every sound was treated as a potential trap. Footsteps, whispers, the brush of cold air. I did not respond. I did not react. I began to notice additional hints, footprints in dust where no one had walked, books open to pages I did not remember shelving them, shadows in corners, moving against the natural flow of light. The building itself seemed to pulse with life, though it was impossible to discern whether it was alive or merely a reflection of my own fear. I no longer trusted my senses. The line between dream and reality blurred. I would see things out of the corner of my eye, dark forms, pale faces, impossible reflections, only for them to vanish when I turned fully. Was it exhaustion? Was it guilt? Or was the library alive? Was she real, or a figment born from my failure, my fear, and my isolation? I did not know. I feared I might never know. By the end of the third week, I realized the following. The library was a trap. The rules were not arbitrary, and the presence, the shadow, the whisper, the faceless woman, was patient. She waited for me to falter, for me to speak, for me to look. I had survived by following fragments of the rules instinctively, but I had no idea what awaited me if I broke them, and every night the risk of breaking them grew. Something was coming for me, and I was no longer sure I would be ready. I had begun to notice subtle changes in myself. Nights no longer passed. They lingered, extending, pressing down on me like wet cloth. I walked the aisles mechanically, cataloging books I had shelved dozens of times, retracing my steps as if the library demanded proof of my presence. The shadows were no longer content to merely follow. I sensed them in my periphery, shifting, gliding, stretching impossibly between aisles. Sometimes a sudden chill would brush against my neck, not wind, not cold air, but the deliberate press of something unseen. The library's silence had weight. It waited for me to make a mistake, to speak, to look. It appeared on the desk one night as I rested, exhausted, staring at the flickering lamp. Do not cross the threshold of the western alcove. The western alcove was a forgotten section of the library, crumbling shelves, spiderwebbed corners, manuscripts covered in mold. I had walked past it before without issue. But now, the moment I read the note, the hair on my arms rose. Something about the words made the room seem smaller, tighter. The shadows near the alcove deepened, moving against the grain of the light. I realized that every time I approached that corner, the temperature dropped several degrees. My breath fogged, my fingers stiffened. I tested the rule once. I stepped closer than usual, curiosity pushing me. The second my foot crossed the threshold, I heard it, the softest sound, like fingernails scraping the wood of the shelves. My flashlight flickered violently, and I bolted, tripping over a fallen manuscript. I understood then, the rules were survival, not guidance, survival. 2 nights later, I found another note taped to the underside of my desk. Do not sit at the central reading table after the 3rd hour. It was vague, frustratingly so. The 3rd hour of my shift? Which day? Which night? But I understood enough. The table was a focal point, a trap, a place where the library's attention could focus on you fully. I obeyed instinctively, sitting instead in the far corner, and that night the shadows became more aggressive. I caught movement in the aisles, a darker figure pacing, stretching impossibly, always keeping distance. The whispers became coherent, my name repeated like a chant. "Arjun, Arjun, come closer, look closer." I did not respond. I could not. The seventh rule revealed itself not in writing, but in experience. I had ventured, briefly, foolishly, into the northern stacks where the oldest manuscripts rested. My flashlight beam trembled across the spines. Something brushed my arm. I spun. Nothing. Then a note appeared, tucked between two leather-bound journals. "Do not leave the light unattended. She watches in darkness." I understood immediately. That flickering lamp that guided my steps, the flashlight that trembled in my hands, these were lifelines. Darkness was her ally. My survival depended on staying illuminated, no matter how exhausting, no matter how small the lights. That night, I kept every lamp on, moving slowly, meticulously. Shadows still stretched and twisted, whispering my name, breathing on the back of my neck. But I survived. The library had begun to feel alive in ways I could not fully describe. The walls seemed to pulse, stretching and contracting. Aisles elongated, curving impossibly in the half-light. Sometimes I would glance down a familiar corridor, only to find it had changed shape. The bookshelves shifted. The floors creaked where they had been silent. I realized that the library was reactive. It responded to me, to my movements, my thoughts, my fear. Every wrong step, every violation of the rules, drew her closer. On the 8th night, I saw her clearly. I had been moving slowly, meticulously, following the 7th rule. My flashlight illuminated the aisles, every shelf in precise order. Then, at the far end, she appeared, a figure, barely human. Her head tilted at an impossible angle, limbs slightly warped, her face featureless but somehow intimate, familiar. I froze, my breath caught. Then she moved, fast, gliding, almost floating. The shadows bent around her like water. She stopped just short of the threshold of the western alcove. And then the air hit me like a wall. My ears rang, my chest constricted, my vision blurred. I stumbled backward, tripping over manuscripts, scraping my hands on the shelves. The lamp flickered violently, plunging the aisle into darkness for a heartbeat. And in that instant, I felt her brush past me, something cold, intangible, a weight pressing against my chest. I collapsed against a shelf, trembling. When I looked up, she was gone. Sleep became impossible. My mind fractured under the pressure. Every shadow became her. Every whisper her voice. I began seeing impossible things. A book would float briefly before dropping. Footsteps echoed in the wrong direction. Pages flipped by themselves, forming words I could not read aloud. I started questioning my own sanity. Perhaps I had always been this fragile. Perhaps the library had nothing to do with it. But then came the unmistakable signs. Fingerprints in dust where no one had walked. Shadows moving independently of light. The feeling of breath on my neck when no one was behind me. I realized the horror was not just what I saw. It was what she made me feel. A creeping certainty that I would never leave if I faltered. During the brief hours of daylight, I began researching Halbrook obsessively. He had been obsessed with crossing boundaries between life and death, reality and imagination, consciousness and the void. Manuscripts hinted at rituals that taught the shadows to watch, experiments that bound spirits to spaces, and cryptic references to her, the presence he had trapped or perhaps freed within his collection. The library was not a building. It was a cage, a trap, a place designed to hold her and, by extension, anyone who dared to enter after dark. I had now discovered 7 of the 8 rules. Each one was more cryptic, more dangerous than the last. Do not look at your reflection after midnight. If a book falls, do not touch it. Do not speak in the aisles. Do not turn around when you hear her. Do not cross the threshold of the western alcove. Do not sit at the central reading table after the 3rd hour. Do not leave the light unattended. She watches in darkness. Following them kept me alive. Violating them brought the shadows closer. I realized too that the 8th rule, the final one, had not yet revealed itself. That perhaps was the one that determined whether I could truly escape. By the end of the week, I could feel her attention intensifying. The air pressed heavier. Shadows lingered in corners, bending unnaturally. Whispers no longer needed to reach me, they echoed in my own mind. Every misstep, every hesitation, every lapse in focus was punished by a subtle, escalating terror. I had begun to fear the daylight, not the night. Night brought rules, structure, and a method. Daylight brought reminders of reality, of failure, of the fragility of my mind. I realized the library was patient. It did not need to chase, it only waited, and I was the prey. On the final night of this chapter, I sat in the corner of the reading hall. Lamps lit meticulously. I did not speak. I did not touch anything unnecessary. I did not cross thresholds. I did not look at mirrors. And yet, I felt her near. A shadow moved across the far end of the hall, not a trick of light. I could feel it, sense it, and hear it in the pulse of the silence. Somewhere deep in the library, a single book thudded to the floor. I did not move. I did not breathe too loudly. I only waited. The 8th rule, I realized, would determine if I survived this night. That night, the library seemed to breathe. Every wall shifted imperceptibly, aisles stretched impossibly, shadows bending unnaturally. Lamps flickered violently, throwing the shelves into a dance of strobe-like terror. The air was thick, choking, smelling of old paper, iron, and something sour, decay. I had followed the 7 rules meticulously, yet instinct warned me that the 8th awaited, the one that would either allow me to escape or doom me entirely. The whispers began immediately, more insistent than ever. My name repeated in every corner, in every shadow, from every surface. Arjun, come, closer, look, now. I pressed my flashlight higher, illuminating every inch of the aisle, but nothing was there, and yet everything moved. The aisles warped in impossible ways. A shelf I had just walked past stretched forward, elongating like a spine, then snapped back, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Manuscripts flew from shelves, spinning like paper tornadoes. The walls themselves groaned and shifted, closing in and opening, a breathing labyrinth intent on trapping me. The temperature plunged, my breath fogged, my fingers froze. Cold pressed against my skin like 1,000 hands. I stumbled over scattered books, the echoes of my fall swallowed by a sinister silence punctuated by whispers. Shadows condensed, forming black shapes with edges that tore reality itself. They lunged, sometimes dissolving before impact, sometimes brushing my limbs with freezing air. At 3 a.m. she emerged, not a shadow, not a suggestion of movement. She became a full presence. Her body was impossibly tall, limbs warped in angles no human could survive. Her face was featureless, a void, yet horrifyingly intimate, like she knew every secret, every fear I had. The air around her rippled. Books flew from shelves toward her, forming a protective barrier of spinning paper. She glided forward, the shadows stretching out to reach me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of fallen manuscripts. Her voice, or thought, invaded my mind. You cannot hide. You cannot leave. You belong to me. I ran. My flashlight shook violently. Books collided with me, slamming into my back. A shelf fell crashing beside me, scattering ancient manuscripts like deadly shards. Something cold and intangible grazed my neck. I screamed, choking on fear, yet obeyed the rules. No direct glance, no words, no panic. The aisles twisted again. A wall that had been 50 feet away now pressed within arm's reach. Shadows darted from floor to ceiling, lunging, reaching, brushing against me, leaving invisible bruises, making my skin crawl. I could not distinguish real from imagined. A pile of books rose in front of me, twisting into a humanoid shape. Faces appeared in the spines, screaming, writhing, pale eyes staring. I dodged a flying tome that seemed to come from nowhere. My own reflection appeared in a broken mirror. I saw myself screaming, but my lips did not move. My shadow moved independently, gesturing, beckoning. The library had become a storm, a sentient chaos, alive, malicious, and omnipotent. I remembered the 8th rule: to leave, you must look at nothing, speak nothing, and follow the path she cannot see. Instinct kicked in. I followed subtle cues. a beam of moonlight reflecting off a tall stack, the alignment of a leaning shelf, the flicker of my flashlight. Every step was deliberate, silent, calculated. The shadows shrieked, twisting, striking at me with invisible claws. Manuscripts flew like shrapnel. A stack of heavy tomes crashed down mere inches from my head. I crawled, rolled, ducked, stumbled. Every nerve in my body screamed. Adrenaline burned in my veins. Near the exit, she appeared fully, not behind shelves, not in the shadows, but before me, blocking my path. The air froze solid, every breath like inhaling needles. Her featureless face loomed impossibly close. The shadows pressed around her, forming tendrils that writhed toward me. I obeyed the eighth rule, eyes forward, silent, step by step, inch by inch. She reached, impossibly fast, a tendril brushing my chest, sending agony and terror racing through my body. Books exploded off the shelves in a storm. Lamps shattered. Dust and paper filled the air. The library groaned, walls bending, ceilings collapsing. I felt my sanity fracture. I followed the invisible path, guided by instinct. My legs screamed, lungs burned, fingers bleeding from contact with sharp edges. The exit doors appeared ahead, impossibly bright against the dark chaos. Shadows lunged, but each time I moved according to the path, they recoiled, unable to cross an unseen line dictated by the rules. I reached the brass doors. My hand shook violently. The last tendril of shadow grazed my arm, cold, burning, horrifying. I pushed with everything I had left. The doors swung open. Cold night air hit me like a tidal wave. I ran blindly into the street, lungs burning, vision blurred. Behind me, the library groaned and shifted, a living nightmare waiting for the next victim. I never returned. Even now, months later, I feel her presence at the edge of vision. Shadows brush against walls, whispers echo in empty rooms. Every mirror, every dark corridor, every silent space reminds me, the eighth rule saved me but barely. I survived, but I am changed. The library waits, patient, hungry. And somewhere, deep inside, I know, if I ever return, the eighth rule may not save me again.